Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
Andrew Griffith, Shadow Business Secretary and MP for Arundel and South Downs. Welcome back to the podcast, A Nation of Taxpayers from the Taxpayers Alliance. Good to see you.
Always good to be here. There's nowhere I'd rather be. It's pretty bleak outside, both weather-wise and the economy, but we'll maybe talk about that.
We'll get onto that in a second. And Elliot, Keck from the TPA, good to have you back on the pod. How's it going?
Yeah, good to be back.
And congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Married
very
man.
Kind, yeah.
Does it feel any different?
Get some tax relief.
Yeah, well, not as much tax relief as maybe you should get. I very much believe that married couples should be allowed to fully combine their personal allowance into one, and we don't allow that in this country. Unlike many other countries, you're only allowed to add a tiny bit of the personal allowance if the other person doesn't work. So it feels great on the sort of romantic sense, but on the tax sense, not as good as it is. I think it really should be if we believe in the institution of marriage and promoting it.
Here. So
we go.
we're recording this on the 1st of September. It's the first day back in Parliament after summer recess. There's a lot of stuff going on over the next few months. We got the conference season. Let's just pick over some of the news stories today, because there's been a blizzard of stuff. There's been this kind of mini reshuffle of spads and spaddy and wonky people in Starmer's office. Elliot, just give us your take on that, and then we'll get Andrew's.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. There's been loads of lobby journalists talking about all the different moves inside Number 10, the Treasury, government more broadly, Darren Jones going into the Cabinet Office. I'm not going to go into sort of all of the inside baseball and all the inside details, but it's been so interesting how the government is very clearly trying to frame this, which is about what this is going to mean for economic growth. And this just speaks to the problem with the sort of centre-left and the left's analysis of what drives economic growth, which is that they think that, if they change personnel inside government, if they set up a new delivery unit, if they set up a new Quango, if they set up a new mission, if government is active, that is going to magically generate growth. And that's not what generates growth. What generates growth is businesses, investors and entrepreneurs. And so if you were actually frustrated with the level of growth in your economy, you wouldn't be just changing your economic advisors and changing the way Whitehall is run. You would be looking at, and this is something that Andrew's doing a lot on, which regulations are unnecessary, which regulations do not deliver the benefits in terms of safety that are concomitant with the reduction in economic growth, and which taxes do you need to reform and cut, and with thresholds and all the rest of it. So it's been such an interesting day in seeing that this government has fallen into that trap that they think that if you are a busy government, you will get economic growth, and far from it.
What's your take?
Well, you can hire a new violinist, which is sort of what they've done, maybe a couple of violas. If you're playing the wrong tune, It makes no difference at all. And I think we will find that. Look, it's well documented, the failings of a large state that tries to do too much. I don't think, learned that lesson in office. I was only in the last government of the last five years as an MP, and you could see even then that it is just not equal to the task that it sets itself, and it, funnily enough, never diagnoses itself as doing less. That would be the real true answer. And we know that this government don't have a plan. I mean, it's pretty breathtaking. I mean, I'm kind of pleased because all the things they are doing are terrible. So the last thing I want them is to do them at greater velocity. But they've certainly squandered a year in office. The country faces huge challenges. And my third and final point, which is really what does this all boil down to? It's the fact that this Labour socialist government, the most socialist in my lifetime, won't contemplate cutting anything, even the most baby steps of welfare reform, when we have a crisis of worklessness, when we have a national debt. The big real story to me over the summer was the ticking up of the 30-year gilt, showing that international investors who finance this country are becoming less and less enamoured with this government. And you can't walk past that one, and you're not going to get past that by, making Darren Jones your, shadow chancellor in Number 10. That's not going to work.
What do we know about a couple of the people whose names have been mentioned? Baroness Shafiq, former Bank of England official, described by Downing Street as a, quote, world-leading economist, and also some chap called Dan York Smith, who spent 2 decades at the Treasury. I mean, are they significant?
None of them have business experience. So my big diagnosis, is, as Elliot said, what is the role of the private sector?
Yeah.
How do you grow an economy by unleashing those animal spirits, those entrepreneurs, the wonderful science and technology and the financial markets, all the things that the natural strengths of the UK. But if that's not your diagnosis, if it's just, can we put on another different layer on top, that's not going to work. I work with Dan, so I was in the Treasury, a very effective civil servant. He delivered the budget process each year. That's very process heavy. By God, do they do process? But there's no blooming use having process if what you pop out at the end of it is higher inheritance tax, disincentivization of people to save for their pensions, and an economy. And just, my final point is, we've got another 2 months. But I mean, Rachel learned nothing, right? We're going to have 2 months where whatever the final budget is, and as we speak, she hasn't named the date even, we're going to have 2 months of complete paralysis. People aren't going to buy homes. They're not going to take out mortgages. Firms won't invest. They certainly won't hire, all because the government doesn't have a clear narrative and it's not doing that one singular thing it should be doing, which is cutting the size of the state and getting to grips with the national debt.
Yeah, and a lot of this is about first principles. So you can be a good economist in terms of the actual practice of economics, but if your first principles are faulty, then you have a problem. So, much of the Treasury now and much of the government has been taken over by the Resolution Foundation, a left-wing think tank. Torsten Bell, in particular, the former director, is now one of the top Treasury ministers.
Well, he's supposed to be writing the budget, isn't he?
And the Resolution Foundation are very good at thinking up creative ways to raise tax revenue, right? And so if you think that raising more and more in taxes and finding new and creative ways to do so is a positive thing, then you'd think brilliant. But we already have a record high tax burden in this country. We not only have a record high tax burden, we have an unbelievably complicated tax system. And so, while there are a lot of people inside the Treasury that may come up with some ingenious ways of raising ever more money, that's not going to be good for the economy. That's great for the government coffers, and it may temporarily solve some issues with funding, but in the long term, that's going to be devastating for the economy because people will make long-term economic decisions based on those tax changes, which will be harmful for many years to come.
My work on Earth, or at least my work here in SW1, will be done when the Taxpayers Alliance plays the reciprocal role in the next Conservative government as the Resolution Foundation does in this.
Here. I mean, it just feels like stagnation. I mean, we'll get on to your shadow brief in a second, Andrew, but I know people who run small businesses, and we all know here at the TPA off the back of the last budget, when that was delivered, we all shook our heads in disbelief, and you could just start to see the concerns coming through from SMEs just going, this is going to hammer us, particularly the increase in national insurance paid by employers. I've spoken to people inside the last 3 months, they've had to sack staff. They've either had to stop pay rises or reduce the pay rises they wanted to give people. It's just going to hell in a handcart. You talk to a lot of the business community with your shadow business secretary brief. What are business leaders saying to you?
Well, the first thing they're not saying is they think this Labour government's wonderful. There was a very brief moment, a honeymoon, and that is fully over. Yeah. I mean, you won't find a single sentient business person in the real world that endorses, for example, the ludicrous employment rights bill, 330 pages, red tape, backing up the employment tribunals, and there's already in many areas a 2-year wait for those cases. So completely out of love with Labour. Look, there's a lot of legacy frustration. I share a lot of this, things that a Conservative government did in office, didn't always feel like they're on the side of small businesses. They were as good at manufacturing red tape, frankly, as any government in my lifetime. Didn't get to grips with the national debt, did impose a very high burden of taxes. So I've got to, I come at this fairly clean, and I haven't spent my career in politics by any means, and I was certainly, even on the record at the time, not in love with many of the tax rises that were introduced by the different governments I served in, but we've got some work to do, right? I've got work to do to show people, as Kemi is doing as well, show people how we have learnt from that and that we will be different. And that's not just going to be words. So I'm hiring a red tape researcher at the moment. Please, TPA fans apply. but the point isn't being another politician who says we're going to cut red tape. I am bored of that. That has happened of every party, of every government in my lifetime, and the red tape has just kept coming. So we've actually got to have specific plans. Which red tape? When's it going? How are we going to remove it? Ideally, in our very first few weeks in office. It's got to be different, because if it isn't, it's not going to be credible. And that's what business is telling me. They want a government that's got their back. They realise it's definitely not this one. They've got a whole bunch of accumulated frustrations over the years, and they're just crying out for a solution that's going to come in and make a decisive difference. Again, as Elliot and I both agree, having a smaller state, a state that does less, taxes less, and gets out the way more.
Yeah, and it's probably that level of detail where Labour have particularly struggled. Andrew mentioned the welfare reforms and their ability to cut any spending. And when they did try welfare reforms earlier in the year, they were relatively minimal. But the way they actually went about those welfare reforms, it was a pretty blunt instrument. So they basically changed the way that you got scored points depending on which activities you could do and couldn't do. And it ended up with some quite unusual things. Like if you could, I think, wash your upper half of your body but not your lower half, then you would suddenly be excluded from benefits. And when you frame it like that, it's actually pretty toxic. When actually what they should have been doing is looking at the vast number of conditions which have seen their numbers surge dramatically and started to focus actually on sort of based on the number of conditions and the conditions that are seeing particular spikes, rather than this far more blunt instrument about what activities you can and can't do. So I think that level of detailism is really important. But just sort of try and flesh out some of these areas, Andrew, that you think are most important in terms of regulation. Where for you, and I appreciate you're probably quite early in this process, which parts of the regulatory burden for you do you think are the most damaging, or or should be the easiest to remove, or the first to go?
I think about it in terms of touch points. You think about business. When I think about business, to be clear, small business is who's in my eye, right? Yeah. Someone who's got a chain of restaurants, a chain of legitimate barbers, running a couple of pubs, a hotel. I'm not going there, but that's who's in my mindset. And you think about the different ways that they butt up against the state. Employment law is huge. Yeah. Right? Not every business owns a huge number of assets, but almost every business hires people. And so the biggest commitment they're actually making with the legal system is hiring somebody, which is why the Employment Rights Bill is just so terrible, because it reframes the risk of doing that just at a time we've got 9 million people of working age who really need to get into the workforce. You don't want to chill it. We've seen this terrible jobless summer, particularly in areas like hospitality. Really we'll be talking more about that in Parliament this week. So employment law. And actually properly looking at how you can incentivize people to take more risk on that, accepting it's always going to be a freedom of contract between two people. Over time, and this is, people think this is a bit too politically toxic, but we've got to talk about this. Over time, getting the right balance about the national minimum living wage. It's tracked well ahead of productivity. Doesn't do anyone any favours if people are priced out of work. The government is going, hell for leather on trying to align an 18-year-old rate with a 21-year-old rate. Now, those are quite different in terms of experience and their need for work. And, most of them would give their eye teeth to get onto the job ladder. There's no point talking about the generational inequality that young people can't get a house if they can't even get a job. So there's a big piece about employment. Second one is, I'm old. In the old days, I'm in my 50s, in the old days, getting a bank account wasn't a hurdle in itself. Access to credit would always be a bit more difficult. Again, you're asking a financial institution to take a risk. But the sheer process of opening a bank account, and I saw this when, not just Nigel Farage, Toby Young was debanked when I was the financial secretary to the Treasury. We've got to make that easier. Right. And if your worry is about fraud and all the other stuff that goes on downstream, first of all, we must keep that in proportion. That word no one ever uses in government. But secondly, if that's really what you're worried about, get them into the banking system, and you can use the data to work out who might be a county lines drug smuggler versus somebody who's just running a business. So first, employment. Second, access to bank accounts themselves, because I just believe that makes it way too hard for someone who's trying to turn their side hustle, because young people are entrepreneurial, right? They've got loads of little side hustles, but it's too hard to become a formal business. The third and final one, Duncan, is HMRC. the conduct of HMRC. These are people who wanted to turn the phone lines off for 6 months of the year, right? And so no one's going to love HMRC, right? We're probably dedicated here and now, in
it's going to be a bit like your dentist.
But you can still discharge your job in a way that helps businesses. You can offer clear guidance. You can hold yourself to account when you, HMRC, make a mistake. So there's a big piece about that, because every business probably hires somebody, it definitely wants to pay its tax or interact with the tax system, which is way too complicated. And then that third one about people being able to access a bank account.
I'll let Elliot pick up on some of that in a second. I just want to ask this question, though, which is, these are lovely words to hear. You identified earlier that when you were in government, the Conservative government did generate its own fair share of red tape. How radical are you prepared to be in the future?
Well, I mean, speaking personally, radical, because I'm here to do that unequivocal job of representing business. Frankly, the nation's growth rate and the level of debt means radical is the only way that we can go if we're going to claw ourselves out of the bottom of this desperate
But what does radical mean to Andrew Griffith?
Well, I mean, I gave a specific example on opening bank accounts. I mean, I would not restrict people opening bank accounts up front. If there are concerns of law enforcement or terrorism organisations, work with the banks afterwards, but don't make it any more difficult than is necessary to open a basic bank account.
Just to touch on the regulatory bits that you want to focus on, and this is the more sensitive part, the one that people are always really hesitant to touch for very understandable reasons is health and safety regulations. And the reason why people are hesitant to touch it is obviously because, health and safety feels paramount. But there are so many regulations now on the books where even the government's own impact assessments say it will do far, far more economic damage than is worth however many lives it would save. The obvious one that comes to mind is Martin's Law, which was passed in the wake of the Manchester terror attack, I believe. But that requires any organisation holding an event of, I think it's 100 people, to do a sort of a terrorism safety check. And that is impacting, events at churches and schools and various other events, and is imposing massive burdens on businesses. And the government's own impact assessment said that the cost of this to businesses is going to be huge, and the number of lives saved is going to be negligible. How do you view health and safety regulations as just too difficult in terms of the framing?
No, that's a great point. And there were lively debates in government about that. And I'm pretty sure, you'll look it up and correct me, but I'm pretty sure I did not vote for that on its final reading in Parliament.
Okay, well, there we go.
It's been over a year since you've been in opposition. You were good enough to come in on one of our first episodes of this podcast, which is great. What's the last year felt like?
I mean, pretty depressing, if I'm brutally honest. I mean, look, let's unpick that through different lenses. It is incredibly depressing. Even as a Democrat, you have to accept, right, that you're going to have different parties running our country. There's never been, and we haven't got long enough for me to objectify this, but there's never been a more socialist government in my lifetime. It is far and away the worst on every single front, and it just doesn't even mind what it's doing. So that's pretty depressing. Watching government with a supermajority for a number of different reasons. There's no point just blaming other parties, as to why they got that supermajority. I'm sure we did, a lot to create that set of circumstances, but that's super frustrating because Parliament can't even do its job, right? I mean, and all governments, again, they all have this sort of cocky know-it-all phase. I hope that over time, independent voices, members of Parliament, find their own voice on that, but certainly that's not been the case. It's just been dogma and prejudice and extremely damaging to our country, and businesses are bleeding out. This is real world. This is not theory, right? The number of people who have lost their job or will not get a job as a result of the national insurance threshold change, right? If you want to be a more left of centre government than I would ever obviously like, be honest about it. Put up VAT, a direct tax that's harder to avoid, simpler to collect. Or if you have to, income tax. Listener, I wouldn't do any of those things.
No, yeah, of course.
But if you're going to do that, let's not overly complicate the tax system, and let's not pursue dogmatic vendettas against independent schools, farmers, landowners, and family-owned businesses. I mean, think about that family-owned business stuff on inheritance tax. It's not even paid by venture capital. It's not paid by international corporations. It's not paid by multinationals who have a subsidiary in the UK. It's not paid by listed companies. It's like literally a vicious vendetta on family-owned businesses who are also the bedrocks of our community, who are putting back sustainably in so many different ways, from sponsoring the local rugby team to being the ones that lend their tractors to grit the high street, all the rest of it that makes up our communities.
Looking back to what the last government did on tax, the 2019-24 government, and just touching on that point, do you think that the 4p cut to national insurance was... I wouldn't want to call it a mistake. Obviously, the TPA supports all tax cuts. But given that cost about £20 billion, I don't like using the term cost, but it reduced tax revenues by £20 billion. Do you think that £20 billion would have been better used to say... You could have abolished stamp duty and abolished inheritance tax. You would have got rid of a vast amount of the tax code, would have massively changed incentives in the economy, completely liberated the housing market. Obviously, everything we could talk about inheritance tax would have been positive. Do you think that 4p cut to national insurance was the right tax cut, looking back?
I mean, the way I defer to your expertise, Elliot. I mean, the way you put that... through one particular lens. First of all, last Conservative government, they've got a better track record than history will record in terms of some cutting spending and trying to do the right thing. After COVID, where, everything blew out, there was a loss of control, the profligacy of spending. Everyone was wise after the event. No one at the time was particularly exercising great caution. But my preference, and I said to certain people at the time when I was in number 10, would have been an exceptional increase in VAT for a certain number of years. Why? Because everybody benefited from that, societal sacrifice around COVID. No one likes putting up taxes, but if you have to balance the books, do so through something that's not distortive or less distortive.
Broad-based taxes. Absolutely.
And taxes on consumption, because you remember there was a period after COVID where people had, they ran out and bought themselves a new conservatory because they hadn't spent money, those that were lucky enough to have had a good lockdown. And again, I'm very conscious a lot of people didn't have that experience, but some did. And a tax on consumption would have been very clear. It would have looked, almost hypothecated for a certain period of time, in theory, to pay down some of the national debt that was incurred. You mentioned inheritance tax. I mean, I was asked, I've got to be honest, I was asked at my selection, what's the single tax, if you ever had the chance to scrap? And it's inheritance tax. It's distortive. It's for most people a double or a triple tax on already earned income. It undermines incentives. And it just, as we're seeing now, licenses the state to go into huge areas of people's private domain, how they organise their life. It's from first principles, inheritance tax is wrong. And, if one had a magic wand, that would be the very first spell I would cast out from this kingdom.
And you're fully supportive of the Taxpayers Alliance Scrap the Inheritance Tax campaign, which is good.
They've done some great work on that.
Let's just move it away from taxation for a second. Let's talk about the ECHR. Because the European Convention of Human Rights is very much in the headlines at the moment. It is perceived by some as a silver bullet, potentially, to try and address the small boats crisis. Would you be in favour of withdrawing from it?
Yes, I would, and I am. But I am with Kemi on this one because I don't think on its own that is enough.
Right.
Because I think the judicial system has gone so far into judicial activism, political activism, I would call it. You look at some of the personnel. It's quite hard to find a judge now, when the Daily Mail does them over and finds out what they've been up to in their private life that hasn't got some sort of left-wing affiliation. And so I'm absolutely with Kemi. Yes, get rid of the ECHR, leave the ECHR, do whatever it takes. But you've actually got to look at the legal system, how judges are appointed, what other conventions that the UK has signed up to. Just to cast back and give you an example, when I was the Financial Secretary of Treasury, I found out when it came to things like debanking, we'd signed up, and by we I mean effectively officials, ministers perhaps weren't diligent enough to see what went on, to all of these international charters and bodies and best practice. And so you've properly got to wade through that thicket to get back to the corpus of common law that you and I would recognise, and where Parliament... It's a long answer, but it's also a failing of Parliament, right? So again, in the quotes old days, the courts would have a lot of regard to the actual words of parliamentary debate. And there would be, things, ministers would be pressed at the dispatch box.
Yes.
They would give clear statements as to the intent. People would put to them theoretical use cases to which a law could and couldn't be put, and Parliament would create its own sort of corpus of interpretation. Now, one, judicial activism means the courts aren't looking to that as much, but also the swinging curtailment of the role of Parliament, of debate, people voting the party line, not enough independent scrutiny, means that a lot of the laws that are passed are deeply, deeply ambiguous. Parliament isn't giving that clarity through well thought out, challenging debate that the courts, if they wanted to, could look to and say this was never Parliament's intent. So you've got to fix both of those things. Not easy, but it absolutely can be done. Get back to a proper Parliament, debating, scrutinising.
Would you, because I think one of the really obvious ways to improve the quality of parliamentary debates, I'm afraid, is to ban cameras from Parliament. So looking at DWP questions this today, of the questions on the order paper, about half of them are what are you doing to address poverty in my constituency of Bognor Regis, or my constituency of Doncaster, or wherever it is. And the reason why people are putting those questions on the order paper is because then they get a nice clip for their social media. What they're not doing is asking a serious question about some area of policy or some set of statistics or one of the government's priorities or whatever it is. They're just trying to get something for their social media. The second you remove cameras from Parliament, you don't have that ability, and so the only way that someone can measure the quality of your parliamentary contribution is in the written record and Hansard, where if you've just asked some party line question, it's going to look very obvious.
Well, in general, look, we're the taxpayers and we want brutal scrutiny and brutal transparency. So let's keep the cameras, but let's look at some of the other things. In my submission to the Modernisation review, I said they should take 2 committee rooms and turn them into TV studios for MPs that want to make clickbait YouTube. Right? Don't clutter up the chamber. If all you want to do is give the world your threepence, trick up, make it look like the House of Cards TV studio. Serious point there. If that's what you're trying to do, you are quite right, Elliot. Then don't clog up the scrutiny mechanisms. But it's also the curtailment of time for debate.
Sure.
And there's plenty of ways of doing that if people actually valued it. Right. The issue is not enough politicians value their role as challengers, as scrutinisers, as people with independent thought, which partly goes to the sort of people who go into Parliament and the background. It's a much bigger topic than we've got. But you've got to find a way of making Parliament work. And if Parliament's not doing its job, and if Parliament is passing ever more laws, and there's a thing I disagreed with my own government about. Every time they would bring forward a king or a queen speech, they bragged about how there was more legislation in it than the previous one. No, that's not. We're conservatives.
Should be less.
We're not there to constantly say we can make the machine spew out more laws to tell citizens how to run their lives. That's not the road we should be on. And yet that is the road that every single government so far has continued to try and do.
Just going back to the ECHR conversation, because I just want to just rewind ever so slightly. And obviously we haven't had an official announcement yet about Conservative policy. There is a rumour that some announcement might be made conference in October regarding where the Tories stand on ECHR. If working on the basis, and given what you said a few moments ago, that there is this idea that maybe the time is right to no longer be part of it, but you need reform in other areas to make stuff really work, wouldn't there be a split in your party regarding that?
I've no idea. I mean,
Well, I think
when you've got
some Conservative MPs, the idea of actually withdrawing from the ECHR,
you've got Jack Straw
shudder.
and David Blunkett and Bridget Phillipson, I think, at the weekend was saying they'd have to look at it and stuff. So I think the Overton window on this one has moved.
But they talked about reform and reviewing it. If I understood what you said correctly, you were talking about withdrawing.
Well, look, I think you're right, and I clearly don't speak for, I don't know where we'll come out as a policy on this. We can all have suspicions, and I certainly don't speak for all 120 diminished backbenchers, though we are. But I would observe that on this one, the Overton window has moved, right? Belatedly. Yeah. I mean, even if you look at something like Rwanda, I was very, very close to Rwanda. I was involved in how we set that Rwanda scheme up. Yeah. I suspect in her privatest moments, the Home Secretary is now thinking, Jesus, maybe it would have been good if we'd got some sort of offshore processing. And at the time, people said it's very novel, it's very extreme. What are you talking about? Now the government's talking about potential safe havens, some sort of offshore, if it's not offshore processing, some sort of offshore repository. It's a big challenge, and I think, this isn't the biggest challenge. Debt is our biggest challenge, to be clear. But in the face of the big challenge, the political class slowly, belatedly, somnolently is waking up and thinking, well, we don't have the answers, and it was more complicated than just, we'll get rid of those Tories and it'll all be wonderful.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You mentioned earlier when we talked about just over the first year being in opposition, it's been depressing. I think that's the word you used. Where does Kemi sit in all of this? Because she's been in the role as leader of the opposition and your boss effectively for a number of months, yet those poll ratings are still stubbornly not budging. Why not?
I'm not in the least surprised those poll ratings aren't budging. People have got memories, right? Wherever it's fair or not, right? Perception is reality. Even in business, if you're a consumer brand, you have to deal with a perception, not the world as you would like it to be, or the world as it would more fairly and objectively be. And it's no surprise at all to me that the Conservative brand remains in the doldrums merely 1 year in. The surprising thing is how quickly the government is loathed. It's universally loathed. It's got the world's worst rankings for any government after this period of time. And of course, other parties have gleefully jumped into that abyss. But the reason that point is even in contention is the hemorrhaging of support away from this government. So I'm not trying to be cute. I am not complacent. I don't think it's just going to come back by itself. But I think bit by bit, if we can look more credible, and over time, we can give people policies, again, backed up by the detailed plans, the next election is not, but should not be, a trust me. Right? It's going to have to be a show me election. It's like, again, memories are strong after a year.
Yes.
They'll be less strong after 2 and 3 and 4 years. We can present ourselves mostly as a fresh party of people who are not particularly tainted by being in cabinet or holding senior, high-profile positions. That's going to have to happen as part of, how you reposition yourself. And then you've got a chance in 4 years' time. And it's just the jaws of probability are wide open, right?
Let's talk about the F word, which in this case is Farage, just so we're all clear. Does he keep you awake at night?
That's quite a funny phrasing of the question.
It's intentional.
Look, I'm not complacent. Parties do not have a God-given right to exist. I think, over time, people can look in a bit more of a balanced way about things that went well in the previous 14 years and things that didn't go so well. I'm a big believer in control what you can control. I can't control Nigel Farage or Zach Palansky or whatever, whatever potential aspirant party leaders. Maybe you've got some aspirations, Duncan. Can't control any of those things. Our party I love, have been a member of since I was aged 14, is hanging together pretty well. I think, I've said this before, I think the new intake are fantastic. right? Fantastic. Great backgrounds, up and at 'em, pretty united. You don't want a party to be overly united. That's, when they haven't got any ideas. So there's lots of things I think, I think Kemi's done a difficult job well. I don't think again, it doesn't matter who's leading us. Most of the challenges we face were going to be endemic to the territory we're playing on, not so much the leader themselves.
Just picking up on something you said a few moments ago. So is it fair to say that you're of the mindset that in order to win the next election, it's not trust me, which is, I think we can say, is the Reform and Farage way at the moment. It's like trust us. What they haven't done is shown anyone their workings out yet. And when they have done, people have been able to, it seems to me, pick holes in it quite easily. Is this how the Conservatives are going to win the next election, by actually going, this is the idea, let me turn it over, the back of the paper, and you can see how we've reached this conclusion, how we're going to fund it, how we're going to do this? Is that where the battle is?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, the big existential battle is, are you ever going to have a democratic elected government that is truly going to get to grips with the challenges that we face as a nation? And I just don't think the old politics of just emoting and saying, I feel your pain, Duncan, and trust me, and it's all going to be all right. I'll be better than the guy or girl who was there previously. I just think that works. I mean, it didn't work, right? It did not work in the last Conservative government. What you need is not technocrats. You need smart people who've got first principle beliefs, who are not ashamed to say what those first principle beliefs are. So they're not trying to get elected with a concealed manifesto saying we're going to be a party of business and then do everything every day before breakfast, lunch and dinner to destroy business. You've got to say what you believe in, and then you've got to craft detailed plans, not many of them, but detailed plans that are credible to say what you're going to do. It's a bit Trump. I don't agree with everything that Trump does. He's much more protectionist, for example, than I would ever be on trade. But, there's an authenticity about, look, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to build a wall. You may like my wall or not like my wall, but I am going to build a wall. This is my plan. If you vote for me, the wall will get built.
On your show me, tell me point, to what extent do you think the Conservatives need to tell the British public some very difficult truths? And the really obvious one that for me that strikes out is we have a social contract where pensioners, middle-aged, often middle class, often quite wealthy pensioners, are given a state pension from the age of about 65, 66, depending on when you retire, that is protected based on wages, inflation, or 2.5% for the rest of their lives. But at the same time, the state will take 40% of anything they have over a certain amount of money. So sort of the state pension is almost supporting their inheritance over that amount of time. To what extent do you think the British people need to be told things like the triple lock just aren't affordable anymore? But the flip side of that is we will get rid of inheritance tax. So you may have to start funding more of your own retirement, but then when you pass, that estate will be fully protected from the grasping hands of the state.
Look, that's a hard truth, and I don't shy away from any hard truths. I think there's a bigger, higher order one, because we're already into sort of, if I may say so, slight policy speak about
of course, understood.
Constructs. The bigger hard truth is we are living way beyond our means, right? And I will say this to anybody. Right, I will say this when I'm on a platform in Midhurst in a couple of weeks' time. I've said it in the paper. I'll say it in Parliament. We are living beyond our means. We do not have the ability, with the level of debt that we have as a society, run up over all governments in my lifetime, to deliver any of the promises that we're talking about, right? I mean, pensions, a high-quality healthcare system, an economy that grows, a defence that is even remotely capable of defending our country if it ever came to it. We can't do any of those things with the sort of finance we have. I was a finance director in my background, so it just, more than anything, I can't walk past that level of debt, the liabilities, the pensions, public sector pensions we've promised people. And that's what we really, really need to get to grips with. I mean, it may come through a crisis. I rather fear it won't. I think governments are extremely good at just stealing other people's wealth. And there's probably quite a lot of wealth that this government can burn through before we get to a crisis. But it's not impossible. But that is the really hard truth. From that, you can start to create, as Mrs. Thatcher did, a recognition and get people to support even things that don't look in their own narrow interest. But it's got, to me, to be downstream of that higher order point about the level of debt that this country is in.
I think we're pretty much done and dusted. Just a quick question, just moving away from politics ever so slightly into your personal life, nothing too intrusive. Last time you were on, it was hot off the news that someone had nicked your Land Rover, Andrew, from Pulborough railway station, I think I remember correctly. Did any update?
No, the crime wave under this Labour government continues. No,
Right.
no, it was never found. I mean,
So what are you doing now? Cycling to the railway station, or?
No, I'm using some even more arthritic cars. But my poor team, I say to them on a Friday, look, I think I'm going to be able to make it to my constituency rounds today, but do be on standby just in case my car conks out. It's very sustainable. I should get some sort of green award for not having a swanky new car.
Yeah, saving the planet in your own way. Marvellous. Andrew Griffith, thank you for joining us on this episode of The Nation of Taxpayers. Elliot Keck, thank you as well. You can listen to a massive archive going back almost a year of various episodes talking to some fascinating people. You can find all of the episodes of our podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And if you'd like to send us an email, the email address is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com.